Welcome to the mid-afternoon session of our gathering. I'm Lauren Winner. I am on the faculty here at Duke Divinity School, and it is my great pleasure and privilege to have been asked to impresario our afternoon hour with Christian Wiman. We've been given the title Theology Through Poetry. So the way this hour and change will go is that I'm going to do a little introduction, then Christian will read, then he and I are going to sit in these lovely chairs on this rug, and I have like 17 questions for him. I'm committed to getting through at least 3, and then we'll have a few minutes for questions from the audience. So that's our plan for the next 75 minutes. Christian Wiman, as you know, was for 10 years the editor of Poetry magazine. His editorship made that journal, for me, indispensable reading, not least because he included so much theologically suggestive poetry. Anna Kamienska's notebooks and Elena Schwartz's insistence, if Christ is to visit us, it will be on such pitiful days as these. And even Kay Ryan's poem Linens, which, authorial intent be damned, seems to me to find in kitchen textiles a perfect metaphor for an unseen God. The journal has not been quite such indispensable reading since Wiman left in 2013 to take up his current position on the faculty at Yale Divinity School and the Institute for Sacred Music. And he's written lots of books that we've all read. Maybe most of us have most read My Bright Abyss, but Wiman is, of course, first and foremost a poet, and poetry is what we will hear from him today. From his forthcoming collection, Survival is a Style, and also some of his earlier poems from Every Riven Thing and Once in the West. Whenever I read his poems, I think about how Wiman, alongside in our current moment, maybe only Mark Jarman and Melissa Range, how he stands in the great Anglophone tradition of Donne and Herbert and Hopkins. And I think what I'm supposed to say about Wiman's place in that trajectory is that he brings to the Donne, Herbert, Hopkins thing a sobering awareness of the secular disposition, an awareness that is self-doubting about its own devotion. But I don't actually think that's an adequate thing to say. I think it's a quite partial thing to say, partial in both senses of the term. There is in Wiman's poetry, of course, this may be inevitable doubting of the poet's own devotion, but there is also irony as a scaffolding that sometimes falls away to reveal an earnestness and a seriousness. Sometimes I think Wiman himself understates what his poetry achieves. In a widely quoted interview with Bookslot, Wiman, and here I'm quoting him, said, "There are a ton of people out there who are what you might call unbelieving believers, people whose consciousness is completely modern, and yet who have this strong spiritual hunger in them. I would like to say something helpful to those people." Surely he does speak helpfully to the unbelieving believers, but they are not the only audience to whom Wiman's poetry speaks, and I mean not that Wiman also speaks to those of us who might call ourselves believing believers, though that's also true. I mean rather that he also speaks to the poetic character he calls Lord. He does this typically at the end of poems. Lord, suffer me to sing these wounds by which I am made and marred. Savor this creature whose aloneness you ease and are. Those are the last 4 lines of a poem called Lord is Not Word. And the lines mark a volta of sorts in a poem that began with a questioning of the kind of speech devotional speech is. Or again, at the end of This Mind of Dying, my God, my grief, forgive my grief tamed in language to a fear that I can bear. Make of my anguish more than I can make. Lord, hear my prayer. There, the poem perfectly names what we always do. We always turn grief into something bearable, finding cliches and commonplaces to label the thing. And then the poem returns its lament of that fact to the Lord, the speaker of the poem acknowledging that she can't see the depths of her own situation. She can't encapsulate it or comprehend it, but you, Lord, can. So please do. So one way that Wiman walks in the great trajectory of Anglophone Christian poetry that is marked out by Donne and Herbert and Hopkins is that he follows a poetic trajectory that explores, in part, just what can be done with language marked by direct address to God. Thus, I keep reading Christian Wiman not only for the generative doubt of the devotional project, but also because he reminds me what poetry is. That poetry is good because it's like liturgy. Poetic language is good because it's like the language we use to respond to the Lord. Please welcome Christian Wiman.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Lauren, for that introduction. That was a good introduction, man. A lot of introductions are not good. That was good. Yeah, you should publish that. That'd be great. I'm going to read, as she said, some poems. I'm going to go through my work and show you some different things and draw some distinctions and develop some ideas that we talked about last night. This first poem is an early poem from my second book called Hard Night. I grew up in West Texas, and the landscape of West Texas is fundamental to me. It's a landscape that I can't escape. It's part of my imagination. I grew up in a little town called Snyder, Texas, which is small, about an hour and a half south of Lubbock. This is called Hard Night. What words or harder gift does the light require of me, carving from the dark this difficult tree? What place or farther peace do I almost see, emerging from the night and heart of me? The sky whitens, goes on and on. Fields wrinkle into rows of cotton, go on and on. Night, like a fling of crows, disperses and is gone. What song, what home, what calm or one clarity can I not quite come to, never quite see? This field, this sky, this tree. It's a poem about being displaced from reality, slightly displaced, always tangentially related to it. And for much of my life, I felt that art really required that kind of displacement, that it thrived, not that it thrived on it, needed it. The image in modernism is similar image is light writes white. Famous phrase. People argue about where it came from. The meaning being that if everything is okay in your life, if everything is light, then when you sit down to write, you've got a blank page. Light writes white. There's got to be some tension. There's got to be some friction. There's got to be something missing. You can't see the landscape that's right in front of you, this field, this sky, this tree, so you got to write a poem. There's got to be something wrong. It took me a long time to figure out a way around that. If that's the calculus that you're making, well, it's a short step from that to, well, let me find more things to be wrong so that I can continue to write about them. This poem is called Every Riven Thing. It was the title of a book that I published before My Bright Abyss, and I had been 3 years without writing a poem, and I had arranged much of my life to be able to write poems. And all through my 20s and into my early 30s, I took this crappy jobs and just did what I could, and in order to figure out how to be a poet. And at one point in there, for 3 years, it just went dry. And I write about this in My Bright Abyss, and 3 things happened. I fell in love with the woman I'm now married to. I got sick, and very sick, and I walked into a church. And this poem was the first poem that I wrote after those 3 years, and I wrote it the afternoon of the first time that I walked into a church in 20 years. It uses one line, and it changes the punctuation. The line repeats 5 times, and it changes the punctuation to change the meaning. Riven is, of course, torn or wounded or sundered. God goes, belonging to every riven thing he's made, sing his being simply by being the thing it is. Stone and tree and sky, man who sees and sings and wonders why. God goes. Belonging to every riven thing he's made means a storm of peace. Think of the atoms inside the stone. Think of the man who sits alone, trying to will himself into the stillness where God goes, belonging. To every riven thing he's made, there is given one shade, shaped exactly to the thing itself. Under the tree, a darker tree. Under the man, the only man to see. God goes, belonging to every riven thing. He's made the things that bring him near, made the mind that makes him go. A part of what man knows, apart from what man knows. God goes belonging to every riven thing he's made. In a minute, I'm going to read some poems from an anthology that I edited called Joy. It's my best book by far. But you ought to buy this one. This one's good. And here's one poem that led me to want to do that project. You can feel joy in the midst of suffering. Happiness gets obliterated. But it is still quite possible to experience joy. This poem is called From a Window. The scene is a person just sitting, looking out a window, and a bunch of birds take off out of a tree. That's it. Incurable and unbelieving in any truth but the truth of grieving. I saw a tree inside a tree rise kaleidoscopically as if the leaves had livelier ghosts. I pressed my face as close to the pain as I could get to watch that fitful, fluent spirit that seemed a single being, undefined, or countless beings of one mind, haul its strange cohesion beyond the limits of my vision, over the house, heavenwards. Of course I knew those leaves were birds. Of course that old tree stood exactly as it had and would, but why should it seem fuller now? And though a man's mind might endow even a tree with some excess of life to which a man seems witness, that life is not the life of men. And that is where the joy came in. This one I'm reading for someone who asked me last night about this poem. I was asked if I had one poem that would distill or express my sense of what suffering means, or maybe the question was how suffering and art were related. I don't quite remember, something like that. But I didn't come up with one. But he suggested this one. It's called "Small Prayer in a Hard Wind," and it's just a poem about a old abandoned house. As through a long abandoned, half-standing house only someone lost could find, which, with its painless windows and sagging crossbeams, its 100 crevices in which 100 creatures hoard and nest, seems both ghost of the life that happened there and living spirit of this wasted place. Wind seeks and sings every wound in the wood that is open enough to receive it. Shatter me, God, into my 1,000 sounds. That one does what she said. It addresses not Lord, but God at the end. I had not noticed that it happens at the end. It's probably a tick. Maybe not, but... Wind seeks and sings every wound in the wood that is open enough to receive it. The suggestion there is that if we're open enough in the midst of our suffering, then it might be transformed into something else. I write prose to explain these moments of inspiration to myself. When I'm writing a poem, I don't actually know what I'm saying. I'm just following the language. I'm messing around with the sounds, following the rhythms. But it's very hypnotic, narcotic, semi-conscious, and I very much write prose as a way of explaining, developing what's happened afterwards. It's very analogous to me, what I was talking about last night, between the moments of when we have faith, maybe joy. The poet Adam Zagajewski has a line where he says, joy in which faith is self-evident. You don't need to say it. Right? Faith, there's a kind of joy that makes faith obvious. So we have moments like that in our lives, and then all that we do to translate those moments into a way of living, and call that a religion. I see those two things very related. So this last one of these early poems is called "My Stop is Grand." It's one of my favorite poems of my own. It's interesting how poets have their favorite poems that they've written, and they don't always correspond with what other people love. I have no idea what people think of this one, but for me it was just, and it may be it gets related to something that's happening in your life. I was very sick, and I'd been into illness. It'd been a while, and this was a relapse of sorts, and it was after a bone marrow transplant, actually. And I had this exchange with the poet C.K. Williams, who's dead now, of lymphoma, actually, leukemia. And it was C.K. Williams is a very well-known poet, Pulitzer Prize winning, all this stuff. And I was running something by him in the magazine, an essay, and was having an exchange, and I got irritated, and he said something that irritated me, and I responded sharply, and then he responded. So we had this. It turned out great. We had this really interesting exchange. But he believed that poetry was a personally redemptive activity, and he was writing an essay about Larkin and Philip Larkin and George Herbert, and he was saying that it was easy for George Herbert because he had a God that he could turn to, but in fact Larkin was braver, because he would not have any belief at all. And if you don't know anything about Larkin, he's like the great grump of English poetry. He's a great poet, but late in his life, he'd gone 10 years without writing a poem, and his last poem is called Obad, and it begins, I work all day and get half drunk at night. Waking at 4 to soundless dark, I stare. In time, the curtain edges will grow light. Till then, I see what's really always there, unresting death, a whole day nearer now, making all thought impossible, but how and where and when I shall myself die. Arid interrogation. Yet the dread of dying and being dead flashes afresh to hold and horrify. It goes downhill from there. It doesn't. So this poem is a response of sorts to Philip Larkin. My stop is Grand. Grand is a train station in downtown Chicago where the Poetry Magazine offices used to be. There's another station mentioned in here called Clark and Division. And what this poem is I used to take the train into work every day, and everyone would get packed on there, and I hated it. And it seemed to me that everybody else was hating it. And one day we were going down there, and I saw this fantail of sparks like you'll see sometimes. And this was in the middle of a Chicago winter, which is brutal, and I just saw this fantail of sparks. And this poem eventually happened, and it happened like that, like the Every Ribbon thing. It happened in one burst. I wrote it in the middle of the night. I got up in the middle of the night after arguing with C.K. Williams, and I wrote this. I have no illusion, some fusion of force and form will save me. Bewilderment of bone light ungrave me. As when the L shooting through a hell of ratty alleys where nothing thrives but soot, and the rat-like lives that have learned to eat it, screechingly peacocked a grace of sparks so far out and above the fast curve that jostled and fastened us into a single shock of, I will not call it love, but at least some brief and no doubt illusionary belief that in one surge of brain we were all seeing one thing, a lone, unearned loveliness struck from an iron pane. Already it was gone. Already it was bone. The gray sky and the encroaching skyline pecked so clean by raptor night, I shuddered at the cold gleam we hurtled toward like some insentient herd plunging underground at Clark and Division. And yet all that day I had a kind of vision that's never gone completely away of immense, clear-paned towers and endlessly expendable hours through which I walked teeming human streets, filled with a shine that was most intimately me and not mine. For me, that's an image of Christ, filled with a shine that was most intimately me and not mine. So I edited this book of poems, and she mentioned Kay Ryan, so I'll read one by Kay. This was a great pleasure. I have a very antagonistic relationship to my own work, but I love other people's poems and have come to love it more and more as I've gotten older. I think when you're young, there's something predatory in the way that you read, that you're just trying to steal something or trying to learn, or you're competitive. But as I've gotten older, it's very simple. I have a more sympathetic relation to what I read, and I'm much more delighted by it. I edited Kay Ryan's prose recently, and it's a long story, but it's coming out in the spring. It's a great book, and I want to read this little poem. This book has some prose here that matches some of the poems, and this is from a little essay that Kay wrote as well. Right now I am thinking of something unlikely that I saw a few days ago, the morning after my town had experienced a major winter flood. In the middle of a residential street, a cast iron manhole cover was dancing in its iron collar, driven up 3 or 4 inches by such an excess of underground water that it balanced above the street, tipping and bobbing like a flower, producing an occasional bell-like chime as it touched against the metal ring. This has much to say about poetry. For I do not want to suggest in any way that this aquifer under poetry is something silly or undangerous. It is great and a causer of every sort of damage. And I do not want to say either that the poem that prompts me to laughter is silly or light. No, it can be as heavy as a manhole cover, but it is forced up. You can see it would take an exquisite set of circumstances to ever get this right. This is called ideal audience. People ask you all the time who you're writing for. I like this answer. Not scattered legions, not a dozen from a single region for whom accent matters. Not a 7-member coven, not 5 shirt-tail cousins, just one free citizen. Maybe not alive now even. Who will know with exquisite gloom that only we two ever found this room? I like that. Exquisite gloom that only we two ever found this room. Part of the power of poetry is the impersonal intimacy that it enables. You feel your heart connected to someone whose heart you don't know really, but you feel it. It's a very powerful and sustaining form of communication. This one of my jobs when I was at Poetry was handing out the Ruth Lilly Prize, and it's a big prize, it's $100,000, and it went for a lifetime's work. And sometimes it was fun, sometimes it was less fun. C.K. Williams, he didn't really respond, but the one person who seemed really excited, who let out a whoop, was Lucille Clifton. And she let out a big whoop when I told her, and then she said, "Oh, I never win anything." That's the writer's life all over right there. I find joy like faith in that you can't will it. You can say that you choose to have faith. I don't really believe it. I think faith is a matter of grace. But what you can do is prepare yourself for it. It can be a matter of readiness. And that's what this poem is about, and it's called Hag Riding. Why is what I ask myself. Maybe it is the African in me, still trying to get home after all these years. But when I wake to the heat of morning, galloping down the highway of my life, something hopeful rises in me, rises and runs me out into the road, and I lob my fierce thigh high over the rump of the day, and honey, I ride. I like that. And the last one from this book is a poem by Osip Mandelstam. Mandelstam was part of a very astonishing generation of Russian modernists. And he was eventually killed by Stalin. This is a long story, but there's a great book by his wife, Nadezhda Mandelstam, called Hope Against Hope, which tells the story of their last years. And he's important to me. I translated this poem with the poet Ilya Kaminsky. And I did it when my kids were 1 and I was sick, and I did half the translations with, they're twins. And so I would sometimes have them in the morning. My shift was in the morning, and I would have them, and yet I was translating at the same time. It was something I could do. And I would be communicating with Ilya by email sometimes 10, 15 times a day. And it was really, really joyful to be able to do it. And it was joyful amidst much suffering. This is the last poem that we have from Mandelstam, we think. He actually had four poems on the last day that he was seen by anyone. I like to think this was the last one. He was eventually found picking through last anybody saw him, he was picking through a garbage dump for food on his way to Siberia. And I was alive. You think about I sometimes think that we're all meant to be the lens for some experience. There's some one experience that we're the expression of. It's amazing to think of this one. And I was alive. And I was alive in the blizzard of the blossoming pear. Myself I stood in the storm of the bird cherry tree. It was all leaf life and star shower, unerring, self-shattering power, and it was all aimed at me. What is this dire delight, flowering, fleeing, always earth? What is being? What is truth? Blossoms rupture and rapture the air, all hover and hammer, time intensified and time intolerable sweetness, raveling rot. It is now. It is not. He was an amazing poet, Osip Mandelstam. Okay, a few of these new poems. I started with that poem, Hard Night. I've wondered what it would be like to be able to write an entire book with no religious language, or at least with the word God purged from it. What might faith look like in that instance? And this poem is called We Pray God to Be Free of God. The quote is from Meister Eckhart. And it takes that same scene. I'm in Connecticut in this poem, but I'm taking that same scene from Hard Night of West Texas. Avid the vastness to eat everything in sight. Bone mule, dun man, westward, leastward grow the trees, even the clouds irradiated into blue. Here in Cucumber, Connecticut, it reaches even me. Hard land, hard light that I without seeing see. It would be a mercy not to name it God. It would be assent and assertion both to stand. Human, in a final light, feeling nothing but light, as from the land and from the mind it fades and seeds to even greater space. It would be nerve and star, nowhere, near. It would be creeping, and it would be teeth. It would be darkness, darkness, darkness. And it would come morning. This is called All My Friends Are Finding New Beliefs. All my friends are finding new beliefs. This one converts to Catholicism and this one to trees. In a highly literary and hitherto religiously indifferent Jew, God whomps on like a genetic generator. Paleo, keto, zone, South Beach, bourbon. Exercise regimen so extreme she merges with machine. One man marries a woman 20 years younger and twice in one brunch uses the word verdant. Another's brick-fisted belligerence gentles into dementia. And one, after a decade of finical feints and teases like a sandpiper at the edge of the sea, decides to die. priesthoods and beasthoods, sombers and glees, high-styled renunciations and avocations of dirt, sobrieties, satieties, pilgrimages to the very bowels of being. All my friends are finding new beliefs, and I am finding it harder and harder to keep track of the new gods and the new loves and the old gods and the old loves, and the days have daggers and the mirrors motives, and the planets turning faster and faster in the blackness, and my nights and my doubts and my friends, my beautiful, credible friends. This poem is in 3 parts. It's called One Love. The first one is Sundays at Smilo. Smilo is the cancer hospital in New Haven. I still spend a lot of time in Smilo. I know it quite well. Sundays are best. The chemo drips through the plastic tube into the port implanted in my chest, and it is quiet, finally. No one weeping beyond the meaningless screens. No one keeping watch for a doctor to tell them what one more meaningless blood test means. No swine of a man emboldened by doom, grunting urges to nurses. No nurses consumed with regularity or insure or code-reading toward someone's spastic reactions to their cure. No cure. The chemo drips through the plastic tube into the port implanted in my chest. Sundays are best. 2. A dusk. How slowly the mountain takes it in, like a diagnosis of darkness. The consolation of a continuation that has nothing to do with you. 3. All you shining stars. There are 4 people in this poem. 3 kinds of hair in the brush one love has left on the kitchen counter. 4 kinds of cries when it occurs as one to blow off school and go to the mountains. And later, over the river, when the upturned duck never turns over, 5 kinds of silence. Always our elsewheres are also here. Like tributaries so intuitive they seem almost incidentally literal. Tiny trickles in wildernesses too immense to enter, the cold clefts and the drastic drops, cliffs of unthinkable ice. 3 kinds of sleep in the hum home down the dark valley back to New Haven. 4 kinds of dreams behind the headlights, the world springing into being 10 feet at a time. 5 kinds of time when one love wakes up and wonders where we are, and one wonder wakes up another, and another, and another. I don't want to be a spice store. I don't want to be a spice store. I don't want to carry handcrafted Marseille soap or Sampa and yak butter or 9,000 varieties of wine. Half the shops here don't open till noon, and even the bookstores brined in charm. I want to be the one store that's open all night and has nothing but necessities. Something to get a fire going and something to put one out. A place where things stay frozen and a place where they are sweet. I want to hold within myself the possibility of plugging one's ears and easing one's eyes. Superglue for ruptures that are, one would have thought, irreparable. A whole bevy of non-toxic solutions for everyday disasters. I want to wait brightly lit and with the patience I never had as a child for my father to find me open on Christmas morning in his last-ditch lone wolf drive for gifts. Light of the world pin light, bobblehead compass, fuzzy dice. I want to hum just a little with my own emptiness at 4 a.m., to have little bells above my door, to have a door. Here's a good one for the Divinity School. 10 distillations. I won't explain all the words, but I'm sure you know them, but the verses explain them. They're all little couplets. Apophatic. He talked of nothingness until it wasn't. He bragged his gravity into God. Convert. What did he learn when he learned of his own bad heart? That scared and sacred are but a beat apart. Skeptic. His eyes were open, but his heart was shut. At the edge of every wonder, he said, but. Inspiration. The clearest morning is a thing to bear, he writes, overjoyed once more by despair. Knowledge. To touch the summit was to learn so much, among which there are some summits you can't touch. Via negativa. He names his love by naming what he hates. Joy generalizes, pain individuates. Near death. Not beyond, but beyond my power to tell. What Eden sweeter than the one in hell? Apophatic. Why wouldn't I praise the vacuous black? The one abundance I could trust was lack. Natural theology. Dawn, light dew on the grass, the air cool, clear. Nothing more, nothing mere. And the last one is the end of prayer. That I might cry life like any bird belonging to its dawn. Let me read one more. Should I read this insane one? No, I read this. It's called A Light Store in the Bowery. Short little poem, A Light Store in the Bowery. Some love is like a light store you slip inside only to escape the rain. Something to see, it turns out. The plasma lamps, mosque and lava, the elegant icicles of the chandeliers. Shapes and shades so insistently singular that rooms can't help but happen around them. Lives can't help but acquire choices and chances inside. Some love is like an old owner who, when a child walks in with her parents, can only imagine shatterings. And some love is like that child asking with an earnest and exemplary awe, where do they keep the dark? Thank you.
Are these on? These are on. Thanks for those poems. Yeah, I think you can hear me.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Okay.
Mine's not.
You can hear
on?
Christian.
Okay.
I have questions. I've had some of these questions for you for years, and now I get to ask them. It's very exciting for me. We have about a half an hour. So, as I indicated, I've had questions for Christian for years. I'm going to ask some of them, and then we'll have some minutes with some roving microphones for the questions that you have had for Christian for years. So you've been at Yale Divinity School for 6 years, right? So I would love to know two things about that. I would love to know how being in a divinity school has affected, changed, enriched, deadened your imagination and poetry. And also I'd love to know if the poetry you teach there is the same as the poetry you read.
This is on, right? Yeah, I have some of my students in the audience. I'm looking at. I don't know how. I couldn't say how it's affected it. It's definitely has been an unusual move for me. But I can't tell if it's the unusual part is moving into the divinity school or into academia. I never spent a day in graduate school in my life. I couldn't wait to get out of school, to tell you the truth, it was all I could do to get through college. And so the academic environment is a little odd for me. I like the divinity school a lot, and I especially like my students there a lot. I couldn't exactly say how it's affected my work. I don't know. I certainly teach the same things that I read, though. And often if I'm reading something that I love, I'll bring it right into the class and immediately. And I have no particular goal of it being religious. I'll often bring things in just to show them something else, you know.
So like who? Who are the 3 people you think you'll be bringing in this month?
Well, I've been reading William Bronk. Well, actually, I just got an email from, I see Barrett, you're in the class. I got an email from Carolyn Forche, and she's coming to town, surprisingly, and she's going to come into our class. So we just read Carolyn Forche last week, and so, yeah, that's cool. I've been reading William Bronk, who's a forgotten poet, but was a contemporary with Wallace Stevens, and I'm going to bring some of those in soon, and I love them. The early poems, I just love them. Has anybody in here read William Bronk? See, that's amazing. I mean, no one has it.
Give us a few more times for that.
Well, he's very abstract, and I haven't memorized any of his poems yet. I wish I could. I will, but I can't quote any of them. He's very abstract, like actually utterly abstract. I mean, so that there's nothing in there that's concrete. And so if you described that to me, I would say, well, that's a poetry that I'm going to hate. But he manages to make that abstraction feel like a concretion. And he's constantly articulating the distance between consciousness and reality. That's what his poems are almost always about. And I just find them very, very moving, beautiful.
So, as a poet, would you say that you've learned more about poetry and how to write poetry and how to make a poem from Christian and Jewish poets or from poets who are neither Christian nor Jewish? And why?
I have no idea. I mean, half the time I don't know a person's belief. So probably, but in the history of English poetry, you know, they were either Christian or Jewish. So, I mean, that's where that's how I came up as a poet. But these days, you know, I don't know. I'm not even conscious of learning from people in that way, of thinking of their beliefs and then learning from, I don't know. I'm fascinated with the question of what constitutes faith. Because last night I talked some about this, but I experience what seem to me avenues or access to God in poems that were written by poets who themselves would disclaim any kind of belief in God. And that fascinates me. I wrote a whole book about it. I find that very interesting.
So, I myself am not that interested in belief per se, but I am interested in use of the Christian lexicon and articulation to what I would describe as sort of classical Christian themes. So you are, I think, as a poet, widely taken to be a poet who makes use of the Christian lexicon sometimes, as we just heard, and who sometimes is writing alongside or in the company of or tangoing with explicitly Christian themes. Do you accept that description of yourself?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, good, part one. So what would you say is the state of contemporary poetry that could be described those ways, drawing on the Christian lexicon and engaging classical Christian themes? Who's writing it? Who's reading it? What's it, in the broader contemporary poetry landscape, what's going on with poetry that is lexically engaged with Christianity and thematically engaged with Christianity?
Well, this is where it gets confusing, because I think there are a handful of poets who are themselves Christians and do that. Richard Wilbur was a famous example. Les Murray, who just died recently, another one. Anne Carson is a poet I admire very much, a Canadian poet, doesn't call herself a Christian, but goes to Catholic Mass every week. Because she says it enables a kind of thinking that she can't find anywhere else. And then there are all these poets who, though they wouldn't call themselves Christian at all, are always using that language. Carl Dennis is a great example, and we spoke of him in my class last week. He is somebody who, if you just sat down and read his poems, you'd say, this guy's a Christian. But nothing could be further from the truth. He says he uses them because of their historical associations and because of the kind of meaning that they enable. And the question that we were raising in class, well, is that a problem? If the language has no purchase on you at the root of yourself, then how can it have meaning in your poems? Shouldn't the task of a poet be to reinvent the language? If you're feeling this kind of faith, shouldn't you be reinventing the language? That seems to me a real question. But then there are all these poets like, I think of A.R. Ammons, who uses that language, but again would not consider himself a Christian. When you consider the radiance that it does not withhold itself, but pours its abundance without selection into every nook or cranny not overhung or hidden. That whole poem, when you consider the radiance, is about, it seems like it's about the Holy Spirit, and yet he had nothing to do with that. So I think it narrowly defined Christian poetry is boring in this country. Like if you just look at it like a Christian anthology, I usually don't like it. But if you think of like the Christian language, how it exists in poetry, it's everywhere, everywhere.
Yeah, it's an interesting question you raise about Dennis. This question of does the gap between the poet's self-professed self-description, I mean, who cares? I can't imagine caring. Personally, I can't imagine caring about that. Like, the language is doing what it's doing. Why Carl Dennis is attracted to a particular lexicon is neither here nor there, it seems to me.
Yeah, I do care. I do. Something seems, I haven't articulated it completely to myself, except as I just did. I respond to some of his poems. I don't respond to the ones that have this particular Christian flavor. They feel a little fraudulent to me, but
what if it were anonymous? I mean, is it something in the poem, or is it to do with...
That's the question, yeah. Once you know, it's hard to unknow, it's hard to, once I know what he thinks about religion.
Maybe he doesn't know what he thinks. Maybe the poem is what he thinks. His own account of what he thinks is...
That's the question is, in my experience, the poem always knows more than the poet. And so is the question then saying, well, this is actually what you are, and then after the poem is over, he's like, well, no, I'm not. So that's the question. That's the real question. But I do think a poem can teach you something like that. But I don't know. Anne Stevenson, the British poet, says that this is all BS. That these poets have got to get over it. If they're honestly atheistic, then stop relying on this transcendental language to have these moments. That you've got to find a language of your own. And
So
I
that's
think
like the overuse of minor chords. I mean,
Right.
is that? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Or it's like the use of God. Every time you come to a point where you can't say something or where you want to suggest the ineffable, you say God, though the word means nothing to you. And I don't know, it seems to me a problem.
That's interesting. I read that you've been reading Amichai a lot lately. You heard
Yeah.
Amichai?
Yeah.
Talk to us about why you've been reading him, the great 20th century Israeli poet whose themes, I think, are quite similar, mutatis mutandis, to some of your themes.
Yeah, and it's actually very relevant to this conversation because he was raised Orthodox Jewish, born in Germany actually, but then moved to Israel when he was a kid. And he didn't sort of have a conversion to atheism. He just said he got bored with it all. And he drifted away from belief or anything. Just said he got bored. And yet his poems are filled with references to God, to Scripture. He knew the Scripture inside out. And his whole oeuvre is like that. There's one great one. From the book of Esther, I filtered the sediment of vulgar joy. Any of you read? From the book of Isaiah, the howl of pain in the guts. I think I can do it. From the book of Isaiah, the howl of pain in the guts. And from Genesis, the dreams and Cain. And from the Song of Songs, the endless search for love. And from Ecclesiastes, the despair. And from the book of Job, Job. There's a second stanza. A woman asked me last night on the dark street how another woman was who'd already died before her time, and not in anyone else's time either. Out of a great weariness, I answered, she's fine. She's fine. It's a wonderful poem. You strip all that out of the Bible, and the lie enters his life like that too. Out of a great weariness, I answered, she's fine. She's fine. Amichai is, I think, one of the very greatest poets of the last 50 years. I think I just am amazed at what he did, and partly because he somehow created a language that can survive translation, and it's his metaphorical intelligence that did it, and is absolutely fidelity to a kind of demotic, plain speech. But he has multiple translators, and you get the sense that they all, I mean, he has good poems in all of these different translators. And that has just not happened very often. Like if you read Rilke across these translators, and I mean, you can always tell when you're reading Rilke, this is a great poet, and I am missing a lot. I'm missing a whole lot. But with Amichai, you feel like, I mean, you're missing something too, but he created a language that mysteriously comes through in the translations, and it's amazing to me.
So on that, and thinking in part of the simplicity of his syntax, I think is part of what is simple about his poetry. You, as you mentioned, often write prose as well as poetry. What is it specifically vis-a-vis the life of faith, vis-a-vis Christianity? What is it that poetic language can do that prose or non-poetic language doesn't seem equipped to do?
Yeah, for me it's the sound. It's very much a matter of sound and form that work in the way that music does. So it's an abstract conveyor of meaning that you hear over and apart from the words. Amichai is a troublesome example, though, because obviously he's coming through in translation. You're not hearing what he wrote originally, and a lot of it is prosy sounding sometimes. You know, so there are people who slip through. Actually, Ann Carson's another one. You know, she's another one for me who. Am I mentioning people that no one has read? I don't mean to be doing that, but at any rate, Ann Carson's a wonderful poet, but she doesn't have a lot of formal sense. And she actually wrote one of her most famous books in prose, and then she didn't like the way it looked, and so she broke it up into lines. And if you told me that somebody did that, I would say, well, that's ridiculous. You can't. That's terrible. But it's quite a moving book. It's quite good, and so I think there's a whole range, but what I respond to most powerfully in poetry is always the sound of it.
Questions from the audience? There are mics running around, or there will be mics, and maybe we'll start with Bruce Herman.
I can repeat the question if you. Yeah.
Something just caught my ear, and that was that on a high you translated, and you're not losing a lot in translation. And I'm wondering if that correlates somehow to William Carlos Williams' idea that good poetry ought to be no ideas but in things. And so if you have this demotic flatness in a sense that it's all about things, then that translates. But if it's all about words, if it's just or ideas, it gets messy.
Yeah, and the music. The question is again about translation. Robert Frost just did not believe in translation. Didn't believe it could be done, and maybe his poems can't be done. I don't know. I mean, they are incredibly sonically identifiable, and. Yeah, well, Shakespeare into German. Germans love Shakespeare, so it really depends on who's doing the translating.
Other questions?
Back there.
First off, thank you both so much. This has been really great. My question's about the tension between faith and doubt in your work. I think what I appreciate so much about it is that wrestling, and I guess I'm curious about how you continue to keep a kind of motivating tension in work during a time of kind of certainty or a kind of a feeling of stability about your own faith.
Feeling instability or
feeling of stability.
Feeling of
how
stability?
You keep that motivating tension.
Do I emanate a sense of stability?
You got your moments.
Can I just tack on an additional question to
Yeah.
that I think is related? How does it not become simply a posture and a conceit?
Oh. But that's my question. Is that I think you should. I think it does. I mean, I think it happens to every writer, and you have to find some way of abrading that tendency, going the other direction. That's what I mean about. I would like to write a book in which didn't have the word God in it. This book actually does have all kinds of. I read a few of those poems that are much looser. They're not so sonically locked. There's a lot of humor in the book. And some of it is just not about obvious issues of faith. But I find this a pretty insoluble question about how you remain receptive and keep developing as an artist. Because in fact, I think it's heartbreaking, but I think most poets have about 10 years when they're really good. And that's it. It's maybe different for some, but there are a few exceptions. But I think if you look across the history of poetry, it all happens in like 10 years for them, and not always, but often. And so I've had mine, man.
Like mathematics.
Yeah.
Other questions?
Thanks so much. I'm really curious about your reading of old poetry, like very old. I know that you like Thomas Hardy, or you've said things about him, and I remember one poem in one of your classes about like a bird that shuts its wings for better flight. Like that's a more of an early modern one. And I also know that you, Chris, know what you think about poems real fast. Like, they sort of make an impact on you, and you can say, I like this one, or I don't like this one, or it's a good one or a bad one. how do you balance like learning a new kind of poetry, like if you read really old stuff or stuff from a different place or a different kind of person, with your taste? What's that process been like for you?
To tell you the truth, it's just exactly the same. I mean, I read a poem by George Herbert and can tell instantly if I like it or don't. Or you know, I don't read any differently. When I'm reading a contemporary poet and reading John Donne, I bring the same expectations to the page.
Which is what?
Do I like it? That's it. I mean, do I like it? And if I like it, then I'll keep with it. If there's something there that appeals to me, but if there's not, and there are all kinds of poems by John Donne that people love that I do not like, and so I don't teach them, and I just don't respond to them.
Rumor has it you're not a great fan of Elizabeth Bishop, for example.
Well,
In the canon of poets we're supposed to like a lot.
I don't get as excited about Elizabeth Bishop as I do a lot of other poets. It's true. Yeah, it's true. I don't really understand the elevation of Elizabeth Bishop. I just don't find it. I don't find her work as exciting as a lot of other poets. But you know, who cares? You know, everybody has their predilections, occlusions, whatever. Yeah.
Are there any of your own poems or books that you find difficult to read now?
Oh, my first book seems terrible to me. I find it just excruciating, and I find it painful, and I also find my second book actually. I like I like a lot of the poems, but I find the energy of the poems, the energy of it, depresses me sometimes. I just wish I can just feel what I couldn't break out of, and so I don't go back and read them ever, you know. But
I think it's such an interesting thing about having written books. This, like, to me, it's a very spiritual question, actually. What's the posture of generosity and charity that one ought to have to the things that one wrote 20 years ago that one doesn't love? And how do you, I sometimes hear myself apologizing to people for some of my earlier books, which can't be that's got to be some weird screwed up ego something. That can't be the right posture. I think it's an interesting question, how you live charitably with the things you no longer think that you once thought. I do think it's pretty common. I mean, Faulkner didn't like The Sound and the Fury later. He didn't want anything to do with that book. So related to this question about your earlier books, besides giving you some subject matter, what difference does Christianity make to your life as a poet?
Well, I would have said for years that poetry was the most important thing in my life, and that I arranged everything in my life for the sake of poetry. And I would never say that now. I would say that poetry is a means toward living my life and towards experiencing God, being with God. And if it's not that, then I would rather not have it. It's utterly changed, utterly. Now, I don't know that I can walk away from it with equanimity. It's still difficult, but my relation to it has utterly changed. And the gift that I think that God gave me, I'm quite sure God gave me, was to lift me off the hook that I was on of that kind of ambition, not ambition to be famous or whatever, but an ambition to articulate myself in a poem, to fix myself in time, at a moment in time, like a rock in the river of time. And I got freed from that. And it was a big deal. It's a big freedom, because I felt I hadn't realized just how distorted my life was because of that.
A reordering of loves.
Yeah, definitely, yeah.
Well, that seems like a good note to end on. a reordering of loves. So thank you for being here. We will gather again at 7 o'clock in Baldwin Auditorium on East Campus for music. See you then. Thanks, Christian.
Thank you.